The morning of July 17th, 1944, broke hot and humid over the green hills of Guam. Major Takeshi Takashina of the Imperial Japanese Army crouched in a concrete bunker 3 miles inland from the coast, studying a hand-drawn map by candlelight. His intelligence reports insisted the American landing force was still consolidating beachheads near Asan and Agat. His forward observers confirmed no enemy infantry approached his position. The jungle between his men and the coast remained quiet, undisturbed. Then the world came apart. The first shell struck 200 meters to his left. Not the sharp crack of a tank gun or the whistle of naval fire from ships offshore. This was different. The sound arrived with a deep, tearing roar, as if the sky itself had been ripped open. The explosion threw dirt 40 feet into the air. Before Takashina could process what he was seeing, 3 more shells landed in rapid succession, each one closer than the last. His bunker shook. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. Outside, men screamed. Takashina rushed to the observation slit. What he saw made no sense. The impacts were coming from inland, from behind the American beach positions. But that was impossible. Naval guns fired from the sea, infantry carried mortars, perhaps small field pieces. Nothing in Japanese doctrine suggested the Americans could reach him here, 3 miles from the water, from guns positioned even farther back. Yet the shells kept coming, methodical and devastating, walking across his defensive line with terrifying precision. Within 20 minutes, 2 of his reinforced positions had been reduced to smoking craters. A runner arrived, breathless and bleeding from the ears. "Major, the guns firing on us are not from ships. Our observers say they are far behind the American front lines. We have never seen artillery with such range." For Takashina and thousands of Japanese officers across the Pacific theater, this moment marked the beginning of a profound and demoralizing education. The Americans possessed artillery that could kill from distances the Japanese had believed impossible. And they possessed it in quantities that defied comprehension. The question that would haunt Japanese commanders for the remainder of the war had just been answered in the most brutal way imaginable. How could any defense survive against guns that reached farther than reason allowed? The answer, as Takashina would soon learn, was that it could not. The weapon that shattered Japanese defensive planning was the M1 155mm howitzer, known to American gunners as the Long Tom when mounted on the M1 carriage, though the term was often applied to the entire family of 155mm guns. To understand the shock it produced, one must first understand what Japanese forces expected from artillery in 1944, and why their expectations were so catastrophically wrong. The Imperial Japanese Army had entered the Pacific War with an artillery doctrine rooted in mobility and lightness. This was not a flaw but a deliberate choice, shaped by decades of combat experience across Asia. Their standard divisional field piece was the Type 38 75mm gun, a reliable weapon that traced its lineage to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and had been modernized through the 1920s. It weighed just over 1 ton when limbered for transport, could be moved by horse or truck, and fired a 14-pound shell to an effective range of approximately 7,000 yards, or roughly 4 miles. For heavier support, Japanese divisions employed the Type 91 105mm howitzer, which reached about 11,000 yards, or just over 6 miles. Their most powerful commonly deployed field piece was the Type 4 150mm howitzer, capable of reaching roughly 12,000 yards under optimal conditions. These were respectable weapons by the standards of the First World War and adequate for the campaigns Japan had fought through the 1930s in China, Manchuria. But the Pacific War was not being fought by the rules of Manchuria, and the distances involved were about to render Japanese artillery doctrine obsolete. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive infantry tactics supported by light, mobile guns that could keep pace with advancing troops. Artillery was meant to suppress enemy positions at close range, destroy obstacles directly in front of attacking infantry, and provide immediate fire support during the decisive assault. The entire system assumed short ranges, visual observation, and rapid repositioning. Gunners trained to fire over open sights when necessary. Officers learned to place their batteries close to the front lines, where they could see the targets they were engaging and respond instantly to infantry requests. The disparity became apparent to Japanese forces as soon as American amphibious assaults moved beyond the initial beachhead phase. At Kwajalein in February 1944, Japanese defenders noted that American artillery fire began while landing craft were still approaching the shore. At Saipan in June 1944, Japanese positions came under sustained bombardment from guns that observers initially believed were firing from ships far offshore, until aerial reconnaissance confirmed the shells were coming from batteries positioned 3 or 4 miles inland behind the American front lines. Lieutenant Toshio Kaneko, an artillery officer with the 43rd Division on Saipan, kept detailed notes during the battle. His journal, recovered after the island fell, describes his growing bewilderment. June 17th. American artillery fires constantly. We count more than 300 shells landing in our sector in 1 hour. Our counter-battery fire achieves nothing. Our observers report the American guns are positioned far beyond the range of our Type 91 howitzers. We cannot reach them. June 18th. Bombardment continues through the night. Sleep is impossible. Men are developing nervous disorders from the constant noise. Several have gone deaf. June 19th. We attempted to move 2 batteries forward, closer to the American lines, hoping to bring their guns into range. Both batteries were destroyed by American fire before they could unlimber. The Americans seem to know where we are before we fire a single shot. Kaneko's observations captured the second dimension of the American artillery advantage. Fire control. The 155mm howitzer was not simply a gun with extraordinary range. It was the centerpiece of an integrated system that combined forward observers, radio communication, fire direction centers, aerial spotting, and sophisticated mathematical calculations. This system allowed American artillery to engage targets the gunners themselves never saw, with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to Japanese defenders. American forward observers, trained extensively in target identification and coordinates communication, accompanied infantry units at the front. They carried SCR-300 radio sets weighing 32 pounds that provided reliable voice communication back to fire direction centers up to 5 miles away. When an observer spotted a target, he radioed coordinates to the fire direction center, where trained personnel calculated the precise elevation, charge, and deflection needed for each gun in the battery to hit the target. The entire process, from observation to first rounds impacting, took between 3 and 8 minutes under typical conditions. Japanese artillery, by contrast, relied primarily on telephone lines, strung between observation posts and gun positions. These lines were easily severed by bombardment, forcing observers to send runners with written messages or fire signals. The process was slow, vulnerable to disruption, and limited to targets the observers could see directly. The notion of calling in artillery fire on coordinates provided by radio from an observer miles away was functionally unknown in Japanese doctrine. The Americans added another layer to their fire control advantage: aerial observation. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a militarized version of the civilian Piper Cub, served as an airborne artillery spotter throughout the Pacific campaign. Slow, unarmed, and fragile, the L-4 seemed an unlikely weapon of war. But flying at altitudes between 500 and 1,500 feet, pilots could observe Japanese positions hidden from ground observers by terrain or jungle. They circled above battlefields, radioing corrections to batteries below, adjusting fire until shells landed exactly on target. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, designed to engage high-altitude bombers and fast fighters, struggled to shoot down the slow, low-flying spotter planes. The L-4 cruised at only 85 miles per hour and could fly as slowly as 45 miles per hour without stalling. It was so maneuverable that pilots could dodge anti-aircraft fire by simply turning away from tracer streams. And because it operated well behind the front lines, outside the range of Japanese small arms, it was nearly invulnerable. Japanese soldiers learned to dread the sight of the small yellow planes circling overhead, knowing that within minutes the shells would start falling. But even the sophisticated fire control system paled beside the most overwhelming aspect of American artillery superiority: sheer quantity. By 1944, the United States had transformed its economy into what historians would later call the arsenal of democracy, an industrial machine capable of producing weapons, ammunition, and supplies on a scale unprecedented in human history. The numbers, when examined closely, reveal why Japanese resistance was ultimately futile. American industry produced approximately 4,200 M1 155mm howitzers during World War II. Each gun required approximately 3,000 rounds per year to sustain combat operations at expected intensity levels. American factories produced over 15 million rounds of 155mm ammunition between 1942 and 1945. The math was straightforward and devastating. There were more shells available than targets to shoot at. American artillery batteries did not ration ammunition. They expended it. At Peleliu in September 1944, the scale of American firepower reached levels that defied Japanese comprehension. The island measured 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. The Japanese garrison, approximately 11,000 men of the 14th Infantry Division under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had spent months fortifying the island's complex cave systems and coral ridges. Nakagawa understood he could not win. His orders were to inflict maximum casualties and delay the Americans as long as possible. He did not expect to survive, but he expected to fight for weeks, perhaps months, bleeding the Americans in close combat where their material advantages would matter less. The Americans landed on September 15, 1944. Within 24 hours, they had brought ashore 11 battalions of artillery, including multiple batteries of 155mm howitzers. The bombardment that followed was unlike anything Japanese troops had experienced. American artillery fired not for minutes or hours, but for days without pause. They fired on suspected positions. They fired on actual positions. They fired on areas where positions might exist. They fired to collapse cave entrances. They fired to destroy morale. They fired because they could. A diary recovered from a Japanese private named Kiyoshi Takada contains entries that chronicle the psychological collapse. September 16th. The shelling began at dawn and has not stopped. We huddle in the caves and cannot move. The sound is driving men insane. September 17th. 3 men ran from the cave during a pause in the bombardment. They were shot by American infantry we had not even known were there. The shelling resumed. September 18th. We have no food. We have no water. We have ammunition but cannot fight because we cannot leave the caves. The shells fall everywhere. September 20th. I do not know if I am alive or dead. The noise is everything. September 22nd. This is not war. This is hell. Takada's unit held its position for 6 more days before being overrun. Of the 60 men who had entered the cave complex on September 15th, 11 survived to be captured. None were wounded by American infantry. All had been injured by artillery or by cave collapses caused by repeated bombardment. When interrogated, several prisoners made the same statement, almost word for word. We could not fight guns we could not see. Colonel Nakagawa survived until late November, leading a desperate defense from the cave systems in the Umabrogol ridges. But even he, one of the most skilled defensive tacticians in the Imperial Japanese Army, could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic. American forces fired over 1,800 tons of 155mm shells at Peleliu during the 73-day battle. That was more than 15 million pounds of high explosive, or roughly 1,370 pounds for every Japanese soldier on the island. The Americans did not defeat the Japanese garrison through superior tactics or bravery. They buried them under steel. The psychological impact of the 155mm howitzer extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese officers who survived encounters with American artillery returned to rear areas changed men. They wrote reports that higher command often dismissed as exaggerated or defeatist. They described bombardments so intense that the ground itself seemed to liquefy. They spoke of American guns that fired from distances that made counter-battery fire impossible. They warned that traditional defensive tactics, predicated on forcing close combat to negate American material advantages, were failing because the Americans would not close with Japanese positions until artillery had destroyed them first. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, these reports created cognitive dissonance. Senior officers, many of whom had fought in China or in the early Pacific campaigns, struggled to accept that the war had changed so fundamentally. They understood American industrial capacity in abstract terms, but translating that abstraction into tactical reality proved difficult. How could one plan a defense when the enemy possessed guns that reached 14 miles? How could one protect troops when ammunition fell in quantities measured by the ton rather than by the round? How could one maintain morale when soldiers were being killed by weapons they could not see, could not reach, and could not understand? Some Japanese commanders adapted. They dug deeper. They built more elaborate cave systems. They dispersed forces to minimize casualties from individual barrages. They trained men to endure bombardment psychologically, to accept that survival was largely a matter of chance rather than skill. But adaptation had limits. No amount of fortification could withstand repeated hits from 95-pound high-explosive shells. No dispersion could protect against batteries that fired hundreds of rounds at suspected positions. And no psychological training could fully prepare men for the experience of waiting underground while the earth shook and their comrades died around them. Major Takashina did not survive the battle for Guam. He was killed on July 28, 1944, not by artillery but by American infantry during a final counterattack. But before he died, he wrote a final report to his division commander. The report was never sent. It was found on his body after the battle, folded carefully in his uniform pocket. The last lines read, "We have fought with courage, we have fought with honor, but we cannot fight the sky when it falls. The American guns fire from distances we cannot answer. They fire with shells we cannot count. This is not a failure of our spirit. This is simply mathematics." Mathematics, in the end, decided the Pacific War. The Japanese entered with superior training, superior tactics in jungle warfare, and a willingness to die that American forces could not match. But they entered with an artillery force designed for a different kind of war, facing an enemy who had transformed artillery from a support weapon into an industrial system of annihilation. The 155mm howitzer was not the weapon that won the war alone, but for thousands of Japanese soldiers who died under its bombardment, and for the officers who watched helplessly as their men were destroyed by guns they could not reach, it became the symbol of a truth they had learned too late. In modern industrial warfare, courage was not enough. Range was king. And in the Pacific War, the Americans possessed range beyond anything Japanese doctrine had imagined possible. The technical specifications of the M1 155mm howitzer tell only part of the story. The complete picture emerges when examining the infrastructure that supported it, the training that made it effective, and the industrial system that kept it firing. At the U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, American gunners underwent training that lasted 16 weeks, far longer than the 8 weeks Japanese artillerymen received. But the difference was not merely duration, it was philosophy. American artillery training emphasized mathematics and indirect fire. Students learned trigonometry, ballistics calculations, and the use of firing tables that accounted for variables. Japanese gunners rarely considered temperature, humidity, wind speed, propellant temperature, even the rotation of the Earth for extremely long-range shots. They practiced with slide rules and logarithmic tables until calculations became automatic. They learned to work as part of a fire direction center, a concept that barely existed in Japanese doctrine, where each gun crew operated semi-independently under the direction of a battery commander who observed the target directly. The Fire Direction Center was the intellectual heart of American artillery supremacy. Typically located in a sandbagged dugout or armored vehicle several hundred yards behind the gun line, it consisted of a telephone or radio operator, a computer section with 3 to 5 men trained in ballistics calculations, and a fire direction officer who coordinated everything. When a forward observer called for fire, the process unfolded with mechanical precision. The radio operator received the target coordinates and relayed them to the computer section. Within 2 minutes, the computers calculated the range, deflection, propellant charge, and fuse setting for every gun in the battery. Orders went out simultaneously to all guns. The result was time-on-target fire, where shells from multiple guns arrived simultaneously, giving defenders no warning and no time to take cover. Japanese artillery operated without this level of coordination. Battery commanders observed targets through binoculars and estimated ranges based on experience and terrain features. They called corrections after observing where rounds landed, a process that required multiple shots and gave defenders time to seek cover or flee. For short-range targets visible from the gun position, this method worked adequately. For targets beyond visual range, it failed catastrophically. Japanese gunners attempting to engage American batteries at 8 or 10 miles distance found themselves firing blind, adjusting based on reports from forward observers connected by telephone lines that were constantly being severed by American counter-battery fire. The ammunition itself reflected the industrial gulf between the two nations. American 155mm shells were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Each shell was identical in weight and dimension, ensuring consistent ballistics. Charges were carefully graded and stored in climate-controlled conditions to maintain uniform burning characteristics. Fuses were precision instruments, available in multiple types: point detonating for immediate explosion on contact, delayed for penetration before detonation, and variable time fuses that could be set to explode at specific altitudes or after specific flight times. Japanese shells, by contrast, showed significant variation in quality. Ammunition produced in 1943 and 1944, as Japan's industrial base came under increasing strain, often featured propellant charges that varied in composition and shells, whose tolerances were loose enough to affect accuracy. Storage conditions in tropical Pacific islands, where heat and humidity were extreme, degraded propellant and corroded fuses. Japanese gunners learned to expect duds, misfires, and unpredictable variations in range. Some estimated that 10 to 15% of their ammunition failed to function as designed. The logistical systems supporting the two artillery forces were equally disparate. American doctrine called for each 155mm howitzer to be supplied with 300 rounds as a basic load, with an additional 200 rounds in reserve at division level. In practice, the U.S. Army maintained stocks that far exceeded these requirements. At Saipan, American forces landed with over 100,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition for the operation's first phase. When stocks began to run low after a week of heavy firing, supply ships arrived with more. The Americans never risked running out. Japanese artillery units on Pacific Islands operated under constant scarcity. Pre-positioned ammunition stocks for the Marianas campaign totaled approximately 50 rounds per gun for 150mm pieces, less for smaller calibers. No resupply was possible once American submarines and aircraft cut the supply lines. Japanese gunners learned to fire sparingly, to save shells for critical moments that often never came because American artillery had already destroyed their positions. Captured Japanese artillery officers repeatedly expressed shock at American ammunition expenditure. One officer on Tinian, where American forces fired more than 24,000 tons of artillery ammunition in 9 days, calculated that the Americans had expended more shells in that single battle than the entire Imperial Japanese Army fired in the Philippines campaign of 1941 to 1942. The climactic demonstration of American artillery superiority occurred at Biak Island in May and June 1944, a battle largely forgotten in popular histories but seared into the memory of Japanese artillery officers who survived it. Biak lay off the northern coast of New Guinea, a strategically vital position because its airfields could support operations throughout the region. Colonel Naoyuki Kuzume commanded the 222nd Infantry Regiment, reinforced to approximately 11,400 men, tasked with defending the island. Kuzume was an experienced officer who had studied American tactics carefully. He knew about their artillery. He believed he had found the answer. Kuzume's defensive plan was ingenious and, on paper, should have negated American artillery advantages. Rather than defending the coast or the airfields directly, he positioned his forces in a complex of caves and tunnels carved into coral ridges between 150 and 300 feet high. These positions, known as the West Caves, overlooked the airfields from concealed positions. They were impervious to naval gunfire, which could not elevate sufficiently to reach them. They were deep enough to withstand aerial bombing, and Kuzume believed they were positioned close enough to the airfields that American forces would be forced into close combat where Japanese infantry could inflict heavy casualties without exposing themselves to prolonged artillery bombardment. American forces landed on May 27, 1944. For the first 3 days, Kuzume's plan worked. U.S. infantry advancing on the airfields came under withering fire from positions they could not see. Attempts to assault the caves directly failed with heavy casualties. Naval gunfire and aerial bombing had minimal effect on the fortified positions. By May 30th, the American advance had stalled. Japanese defenders, watching from their caves, allowed themselves a moment of hope. Perhaps American firepower could be defeated after all. Then the 155mm howitzers arrived. The U.S. Army's 146th Field Artillery Battalion landed on Biak on June 1st. The battalion had 12 M1 155mm howitzers and a fire direction center staffed by some of the most experienced artillery officers in the Pacific Theater. They set up their guns 2 miles behind the front lines, carefully positioned for optimal firing angles on the West Caves. Forward observers from the 41st Infantry Division moved into positions with direct lines of sight to the cave entrances and radioed coordinates back to the fire direction center. What followed was systematic destruction. The 155mm guns did not fire at cave entrances directly, a futile exercise against reinforced coral. Instead, they fired at the cliff faces surrounding the entrances, using delayed fuzzes that allowed shells to penetrate several feet into the coral before detonating. The explosions created massive rockfalls that sealed cave openings, trapping defenders inside. When Japanese troops emerged from alternate exits to clear the rubble, forward observers called in immediate fire that caught them in the open. Those who retreated back into the caves found themselves trapped as repeated bombardment collapsed tunnel sections and cut off ventilation shafts. Lieutenant Yoshiaki Hara commanded a company positioned in the West Caves. His account, dictated to interrogators after his capture on June 28th, describes the experience with clinical precision. The bombardment began on June 2nd at approximately 0800 hours. We thought it would be like previous bombardments, heavy but endurable. By 1000 hours we understood this was different. The shells were much larger than anything we had experienced. They penetrated deep into the coral before exploding. The concussion inside the caves was overwhelming. Men's ears bled. Several lost consciousness. By afternoon, the main entrance to our section had collapsed. We began digging out, but each time we cleared an opening, more shells landed and collapsed it again. On June 3rd, we tried to exit through the eastern tunnel. American observers spotted us. The shells began falling before we had moved 10 meters. 23 men died in seconds. We retreated underground and did not attempt to leave again. The 146th Field Artillery Battalion fired 13,400 rounds at the West Caves over a 12-day period. That averaged more than 1,100 rounds per day, or 1 shell every 78 seconds, day and night, for nearly 2 weeks. The gunners worked in shifts, firing through tropical rainstorms and oppressive heat. Ammunition arrived by truck in a constant stream. When one truck was emptied, another took its place. The supply line never broke. The guns never stopped. Japanese defenders, meanwhile, watched their supplies dwindle. Water became scarce as bombardment sealed off collection points. Food ran out. Ammunition stocks, carefully rationed, could not be used because emerging from cover meant certain death. Men trapped in collapsed tunnel sections suffocated slowly, while their comrades listened helplessly from the other side of cave-ins they lacked tools to clear. Psychological collapse accelerated. Some men went mad from the constant concussion. Others sat motionless, staring at nothing, no longer responding to orders. On June 14th, the 146th Field Artillery Battalion adjusted its fire. Instead of targeting cave entrances, forward observers directed shells onto the cliff tops above the cave complex. The 95-pound shells, falling from high angles, smashed through the coral overburden and detonated inside the cave system itself. The effect was catastrophic. Lieutenant Hara's account continues. The explosions came from above us. We had believed we were safe under hundreds of feet of coral. We were wrong. The shells penetrated and exploded inside the main gallery. 50 men died immediately. The tunnel filled with smoke and rock dust so thick we could not see. We could not breathe. Men clawed at the walls trying to find air. Some ran deeper into the caves and became lost. Others ran toward the entrances and were shot by American infantry we had not known were there. I made the decision to surrender. Of the 184 men in my company on June 1st, 41 were still alive on June 14th when we emerged. Colonel Kuzum never surrendered. He was killed on June 22nd during a final counterattack, leading the remnants of his regiment in a desperate charge against American positions. Of the 11,400 Japanese troops defending Biak, approximately 10,100 were killed. American forces counted fewer than 500 prisoners. The battle for the West Caves alone had cost the Japanese more than 4,000 casualties, most of them killed or buried alive by American artillery. Japanese officers who survived attributed the catastrophe directly to the 155mm howitzers. One captured major stated simply, "We had no answer to their big guns. We could not fight them. We could not hide from them. We could only die." The experience at Biak crystallized the hopelessness of Japanese defensive doctrine against American firepower. Word spread through the Imperial Japanese Army, carried by survivors and by interrogation reports that found their way to Tokyo. Officers preparing defenses on other islands studied what had happened at the West Caves and drew grim conclusions. Fortifications that seemed impregnable could be reduced by sustained artillery fire. Positions chosen to be outside the range of conventional field guns were well within range of American 155mm pieces. Ammunition conservation, once a virtue born of necessity, had become irrelevant when the enemy fired thousands of rounds without pause. Some Japanese commanders attempted to adapt by dispersing forces even more widely, digging caves even deeper, and positioning troops farther from obvious targets. But dispersion reduced combat effectiveness. Deeper caves took more time and labor to construct, and positioning troops farther from objectives made counterattacks impossible. Every adaptation carried costs that Japanese forces, already stretched thin, could barely afford. The fundamental problem remained unsolvable. American artillery could reach anywhere, fire constantly, and coordinate with infantry and air support in ways Japanese forces could not counter. At Peleliu in September 1944, Colonel Nakagawa implemented perhaps the most sophisticated Japanese defense of the Pacific War. He positioned his forces in a complex system of more than 500 caves and tunnels, avoided banzai charges that would expose his men, and planned a war of attrition that would make every yard cost American lives. The defense succeeded in inflicting heavy casualties. The battle lasted 73 days instead of the 4 days American planners had predicted. But ultimately, Nakagawa's forces were destroyed by the same weapon that had devastated every Japanese position since Kwajalein. American artillery, especially the 155mm howitzers that fired over 15,000 rounds at Peleliu's coral ridges. By early 1945, Japanese defensive planning had devolved into acceptance of inevitable defeat, with the sole objective being to inflict maximum casualties before annihilation. At Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi constructed a defense in depth across the island's volcanic terrain, with 11 miles of interconnected tunnels and 1,500 fortified positions. He forbade banzai charges and ordered his men to fight from concealment for as long as possible. The defense was masterful. American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties for the only time in the Pacific War. But even Kuribayashi could not overcome American artillery. The 155mm howitzers of the 138th Field Artillery Battalion and other units fired more than 450,000 rounds at Iwo Jima during the 36-day battle. They systematically destroyed every defensive position on the island, one by one, supporting infantry advances with steel curtains that made Japanese resistance ultimately futile. Kuribayashi died in the final days of the battle, leading a last attack from caves that had become tombs for his men, knowing that courage and tactics had proven insufficient against the mathematics of industrial warfare. The men who survived encounters with American 155mm artillery returned to rear areas fundamentally changed. Medical officers throughout the Imperial Japanese Army documented a surge in what they termed artillery neurosis, beginning in mid-1944. Soldiers who had endured prolonged bombardment exhibited symptoms that Western physicians would recognize as combat fatigue or shell shock: uncontrollable, trembling, inability to sleep, panic at sudden sounds, and in severe cases, complete psychological withdrawal. Japanese military culture, which emphasized stoicism and endurance, had no framework for addressing these conditions. Men suffering from artillery neurosis were often treated as malingerers or cowards, further compounding their psychological trauma. Captain Masao Yoshida, a medical officer who served on Saipan and later at a field hospital in the Philippines, kept notes on the soldiers he treated. His observations, preserved in post-war interviews, describe the unique nature of artillery-induced trauma. Men who had been brave in close combat became helpless after artillery bombardment. They would flinch at any loud noise. Some could not hold chopsticks steady enough to eat. They described the experience not as fear of death, but as helplessness. They said the worst part was knowing they could do nothing. A soldier facing enemy infantry can shoot back. A soldier attacked by aircraft can take cover. But artillery gave them no recourse. They could only wait underground while the earth shook and their comrades died around them. This helplessness destroyed something inside them that could not be repaired. The impact extended beyond individual soldiers to unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness. Japanese infantry that had survived heavy artillery bombardment often refused to hold positions when American attacks began. Officers reported increasing difficulty maintaining discipline among troops who had experienced sustained shelling. At Leyte, in October and November 1944, entire Japanese companies abandoned defensive positions and retreated into the mountains rather than endure another bombardment. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, noted in his diary that American artillery had become more demoralizing to his troops than American infantry, tanks, or aircraft combined. The industrial implications became impossible to ignore by 1945. Japan's artillery production had never approached American levels, and by the war's final year it had collapsed almost entirely. Japanese factories produced approximately 2,800 field artillery pieces of all types in 1944, compared to more than 16,000 produced by American factories in the same year. Ammunition production told an even grimmer story. Japanese shell production in 1944 totaled roughly 8 million rounds for all artillery calibers. American production of 155mm ammunition alone exceeded 5 million rounds in 1944, with millions more rounds produced for other calibers. These numbers represented more than industrial capacity. They represented fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Japanese military planning assumed wars would be won by superior spirit, training, and tactical skill applied by forces that could sustain themselves on minimal resources. This assumption had worked in China, where Japanese forces faced opponents with limited industrial capacity. It failed catastrophically against the United States, which had built a military machine predicated on overwhelming material superiority. The 155mm howitzer was merely the most visible symbol of this disparity, but the gap extended to every aspect of warfare: aircraft production, ship construction, tank manufacturing, and perhaps most critically, the logistical infrastructure that kept everything supplied and functioning. Japanese officers who survived the war and later wrote memoirs consistently identified American artillery as the weapon that broke their army's will to fight. General Sadai Inoue, who commanded artillery units in the Philippines, stated in a 1952 interview, "We knew we could not match American industry, But we believed our soldiers were superior and our tactics were sound. American artillery destroyed both beliefs. When your men are being killed by guns they cannot see or reach, superior training means nothing. When your carefully prepared positions are obliterated before your infantry even engages the enemy, superior tactics are irrelevant. The Americans reduced war to mathematics, and in mathematics they were invincible. The legacy of American artillery superiority in the Pacific extended far beyond the immediate military outcomes. It fundamentally reshaped how modern armies thought about firepower, coordination, and the integration of technology into combat operations. The lessons learned in places like Biak, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima influenced military doctrine for decades. The concept of fire support coordination, where artillery worked seamlessly with infantry, armor, and air support through integrated communication networks, became the foundation of American combined arms doctrine that dominated military thinking through the Cold War and beyond. The human cost of this artillery dominance defies simple calculation. Japanese casualties from artillery fire were never comprehensively documented, but post-war analyses suggest that American artillery and naval gunfire accounted for between 40 and 50% of all Japanese combat deaths in the Pacific theater. On islands where major battles occurred, the percentage was often higher. At Saipan, medical examiners estimated that artillery caused more than 60% of Japanese fatalities. The psychological casualties, men who survived physically but were broken mentally, never appeared in official statistics, but numbered in the thousands. For American forces, the 155mm howitzer and the artillery system it represented became a point of pride and a source of confidence. Infantry, advancing behind artillery barrages, knew they had massive firepower supporting them. The presence of 155mm batteries became a guarantee that breakthrough would eventually occur, that no Japanese position could hold indefinitely against sustained bombardment. This confidence translated into tactical aggression. American units were willing to attack fortified positions that would have seemed suicidal without artillery support, because they trusted that the guns would silence enemy resistance before infantry closed with the objective. The technical innovations developed to maximize artillery effectiveness had lasting impact. Fire direction centers evolved into the command and control systems used by modern armies. The integration of forward observers with radio communications became standard practice worldwide. Time-on-target firing techniques, perfected against Japanese positions, remained in artillery doctrine through the Korean War, Vietnam, and into the present day. Even the basic mathematics of artillery fire, the ballistic calculations and corrections for environmental variables, were refined and systematized during World War II in ways that influenced artillery practice for generations. Yet for all its tactical success, American artillery supremacy came with costs that were less visible but equally significant. The reliance on overwhelming firepower created expectations that proved difficult to sustain in later conflicts. In Korea and Vietnam, American forces faced enemies who adapted to artillery by dispersing, tunneling deeper, and avoiding concentrations that would present lucrative targets. The abundance of ammunition available in World War II was never matched again. Artillery units in later wars faced constraints that would have seemed incomprehensible to gunners who fired thousands of rounds per day at Pacific Islands. The psychological dependence on massive fire support, cultivated in the Pacific, sometimes inhibited tactical innovation when firepower alone proved insufficient. For Japan, the experience of American artillery bombardment became part of the national trauma of defeat. Survivors carried memories of helplessness and annihilation that shaped post-war Japanese attitudes toward military power. The nation that rebuilt after 1945 rejected the militarism that had led to catastrophic defeat, and part of that rejection stemmed from the visceral understanding that modern industrial warfare favored nations with vast resources and industrial capacity. Japan could never compete with America's ability to produce shells by the million and fire them by the ton. This realization influenced Japan's post-war choice to rebuild as an economic rather than military power, focusing on industrial and technological development within a defensive security framework guaranteed by American military protection. On the morning of July 17, 1944, Major Takeshi Takashina had crouched in his bunker on Guam, believing his position was secure. 3 miles from the American beachhead, surrounded by prepared defenses, supported by troops who had trained for years to defend the island, he had every reason to expect a prolonged battle. Then the shells began falling, and everything he had believed about warfare proved obsolete. The guns firing on him reached farther than Japanese doctrine said was possible. They fired more shells than Japanese logistics could comprehend. They continued firing long after Japanese ammunition reserves would have been exhausted, and they killed his men from distances that made retaliation impossible. Takashina's experience was replicated across the Pacific, on islands whose names became synonymous with brutal combat: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. On each island, Japanese defenders prepared elaborate fortifications and planned to inflict maximum casualties through close combat. On each island, American artillery reduced those plans to rubble and corpses. The specific details varied, the terrain differed, individual units employed different tactics. But the fundamental pattern remained constant. American forces landed, established beachheads, brought ashore artillery, including 155mm howitzers, and systematically destroyed Japanese positions through sustained bombardment coordinated with infantry advances. The 155mm howitzer did not win the Pacific War by itself. Victory required naval superiority, air supremacy, industrial capacity, code-breaking intelligence, and the courage of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and Marines who fought and died across thousands of miles of ocean. But the 155mm howitzer and the artillery system it represented embodied the American approach to warfare that made victory possible. Where Japanese forces emphasized spirit and sacrifice, Americans emphasized firepower and logistics. Where Japanese commanders expected soldiers to prevail through superior will, American commanders ensured soldiers prevailed through superior resources. The contest between these philosophies was never in doubt once American industrial capacity reached full mobilization. For Japanese officers who survived to witness their nation's defeat, the memory of American artillery bombardment remained the most powerful symbol of why they had lost. They had entered the war believing spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They had fought with extraordinary courage and tactical skill. They had endured hardships that would have broken lesser armies. But in the end, courage could not stop 95-pound shells falling from 14 miles away. Skill could not counter an enemy who fired more ammunition in a day than Japan produced in a month. Endurance could not outlast an industrial machine that never ran out of steel. The question Major Takashina could not answer on July 17, 1944 had been answered definitively by August 1945 when Japan surrendered. How could any defense survive against guns that reached farther than reason allowed? The answer was simple and brutal. It could not. The Americans had transformed artillery from a support weapon into an instrument of systematic annihilation. They had married industrial capacity to scientific precision and created a system of warfare that Japanese forces, for all their courage and determination, had no means to counter. The thunder of American 155mm howitzers echoing across Pacific Islands was not merely the sound of individual battles. It was the sound of one era of warfare ending and another beginning, the sound of industrial modernity crushing pre-industrial military traditions, the sound of steel falling from distant guns onto men who had believed distance meant safety. It was, in the end, the sound of mathematics deciding war, and of one nation's ability to count higher, produce more, and fire longer, determining the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history.